Look, if you're listening to a soccer podcast, you're probably aware that the World Cup is coming to the US, Canada, and Mexico in the summer of 2026. Gianni Infantino, president of FIFA, says
it will be the biggest event ever, not just sport, not just social, but the biggest show that the planet has witnessed in history.
There's Johnny.
And that's just a warm-up for 2030, the 100th anniversary of the first World Cup in Uruguay. That one will be hosted by Morocco, Portugal, and Spain, but will also feature matches in Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And starting next year, the World Cup will feature 48 teams instead of 32.
And if you're listening to a soccer podcast, you may have feelings about the next two World Cups, ranging from exciting expansion of the world's biggest sporting event to bloated cash grab by world's most corrupt sporting association.
That's a pretty big range.
That's a game for everyone. Now, when Tom and I first talked about doing a story about the 1930 World Cup, the very first one, we had different expectations of what 2026 would be like. The World Cup is, at its best, a global party. And since November of 2024, the U.S. has become the world's worst host. Travel bans, needless wars, both tariff and literal, and violent immigrant roundups aren't much of an invitation to enjoy the world's game.
That feels more like the run-up to the World Cups in Russia and Qatar. I'd hoped we'd at least be the outlier in that group, but
life doesn't always live up to expectations, for better or worse. But our goal is to share stories from U.S. soccer history that even U.S. soccer fans might not know, to stake a claim to soccer being an American game, and give American fans a reason to be proud of our soccer tradition. And that feels even more necessary at a time when it's, frankly, harder to be proud of being an American.
Sometimes the way forward is through the past. In 1930, the United States was the first country to register for FIFA's brand new tournament. A melting pot team wore the stars and stripes, as well as denim shorts, and showed that our strength is in our diversity.
This is the story of the United States in the very first World Cup.
And this is
an American game. All right, serious opening aside, and hey, sorry, sports are political. Today is a really fun story. The very first World Cup.
The first anything is catnip for historians.
And screenwriters. Throw in steamships, great clothes, huge world events. If it wasn't raining, it'd be perfect. But we'll get there. I'm Kirk Rudell, the screenwriter.
I'm Tom McCabe, the historian. And as old friends, soccer obsessives, and descendants of immigrants, we're going to celebrate some American soccer heroes from 100 years ago.
Now, some people know that the U.S. played in the very first World Cup. And those people may be thinking, this free podcast is not worth my time. But there's a lot to the story. And even if you think you already know it, we're going to throw in some new details from a friend of the show and grandson of one of the stars of that team.
Let's start right there. My friend, James Brown. Not the godfather of soul, but the godfather of the 1930 World Cup. Because he has put together an incredible network of historians, journalists, and family members. He's amassed a wealth of information from official reports to personal scrapbooks, including his grandfather.
So, let's go back 100 years before the World Cup was the biggest spectacle in the world, when it was just a glimmer in one Frenchman's eye. That Frenchman was Jules Rimet, who was elected president of FIFA after World War I. Now, up until then, the only World Soccer Championship was the Olympics. So the first thing Rimet did was take control of the Olympic tournament from the IOC and try to grow it. The 1924 Olympic final in Paris, the Chariots of Fire Olympics, was watched by 60,000 people.
But Rimet really wanted FIFA to run its own World Championship. And his hook was that the Olympic Games excluded many of the world's best players because, as professionals, they weren't allowed to compete. A proposal for a world tournament was voted on at the 1928 FIFA Congress. Every player would be eligible, amateurs and pros alike. It was approved, and 6 countries submitted bids to host: Italy, Holland, Hungary, Spain, Sweden, and Uruguay.
Uruguay had some special sauce on their bid. Not just because they were the 2-time defending Olympic champions, but they were also going to be celebrating their 100th anniversary of independence in 1930. Hosting the world would be a flex, so they offered to cover all the costs, including travel and accommodations for every team. Any profits would be shared by all the participants, and Uruguay would eat any losses.
So, a lot of money was an offer FIFA couldn't refuse. Sound familiar, huh? Uruguay was named host, and FIFA invited each of its members to play. England and the other home nations, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, gave a hard pass. They had all withdrawn from FIFA because they had issues with what was called shamateurism, payments to amateur players like the ones at previous Olympic Games. Charles Sutcliffe of the English Football League was no fan of the World Cup. In 1928, he said,
"I don't care a brass farthing about the improvement of the game in France, Belgium, Austria, or Germany. The FIFA does not appeal to me. An organization where such football associations as those of Uruguay and Paraguay, Brazil and Egypt, Bohemia and Pan-Russia are co-equal with England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland seems to me to be a case of magnifying the midgets."
I love magnifying the midgets. That's like historically 80% of the English upper class.
I think so is complaining about Bohemia. Anyway, 2 months before the start of the tournament, no European team had entered yet. Even with Uruguay footing the bill, European clubs battling to stay afloat during a worldwide economic depression didn't want to lose their best players to some tournament in South America. And a lot of players were reluctant to leave jobs that might not be there when they got back. The risk was that it was going to be an America's Cup, not a World Cup. What was needed was an emergency campaign to convince countries to send teams.
And the legend is that Jules Rimet traveled around Europe to twist some arms. The truth is that up until a few months before kickoff, France hadn't committed, and Rimet wasn't even sure he'd be going. But Uruguay's ambassador to Belgium and FIFA's VP, Enrique Buero, stepped up. And fortunately for historians, he kept a record, which he later published in a booklet that he sent out to 5,000 people, so they'd know the truth. My friend, the historian James Brown, has a copy of it.
I love being so petty that you basically set up a separate text thread. I also love that Romania only agreed to send a team after their king personally picked the players and made sure their employers guaranteed that they'd have jobs when they came home. So, it was a startup tournament with some geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geographic obstacles. Tom, where was the United States in all this?
If you've listened to our first 2 episodes, you know the answer. Soccer had been around for 50 years. By 1930, there were soccer towns strung across the country, from sea to shining sea. From New England and New Jersey mill towns to the Midwestern hotbeds of St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit. The game had also put down roots in the Pacific Northwest and up and down the California coast. There were professional leagues like the American Soccer League and the St. Louis Soccer League, which attracted foreign talent and cultivated homegrown players. Touring teams came to our shores almost every year, so the U.S. wasn't isolated at all.
The ASL was the brainchild of our old friend Thomas Bullets Cahill from episode 1. He'd spent World War I plotting to grow the game, but in 1920, the U.S. Football Association couldn't even afford to send a team to that year's Summer Olympics in Antwerp. The ASL was a way to make the game more profitable and sustainable. As Cahill expected, crowds were buoyed by war veterans who'd been exposed to the game in Europe and now had become fans and players.
Add to that the fact that businesses were booming during the Roaring '20s, which meant immigration opened up, companies needed workers for their factories, right? And companies that owned soccer teams like Bethlehem Steel or towns with lots of industry like Fall River and Philadelphia could pay good wages to soccer players. As much as $50 a game, with another $50 a week if you worked for the company.
How much could they make playing in the UK?
About £6 to £10 per week. Neither of us is a finance guy, but a pound was a little under $5 in the mid-1920s. So you could double your money, at least, playing in the US.
That's kind of like if MLS was paying twice as much as the Premier League. Anyway, one last footnote about the ASL that also resonates. In the eyes of its owners, the only thing keeping soccer from mainstream acceptance was a sense that it was too, quote, foreign, unquote. They wanted to Americanize the game by updating some of the rules, like introducing substitutions. So the ASL was allowing player subs in 1926 The World Cup didn't come around until 1970.
The U.S. leads, the world follows.
Classic soccer story. And as we'll see, subs would have helped the U.S. a lot in 1930. Anyway, the ASL was thriving in the early 20s, which meant a lot of players overseas wanted to play here. And there was a lot of recruitment, others called it poaching, of top talent from England and Scotland. One time a chauffeur was arrested trying to smuggle 4 British players across the Canadian border for his wealthy New York boss. It got so bad that the Scottish FA complained about, quote, the American menace.
But there was plenty of homegrown talent. Again, the game had been here for 50 years. We weren't smuggling in every good player. Soccer had regional, even national celebrities with nicknames like the Little Giant, Piano Legs, and Babe Ruth. Well, 2 men were dubbed the Babe Ruth of American soccer in this era, Archie Stark and Billy Gonzalez. Why don't you tell us about Archie, Kirk?
Archie Stark was born in Glasgow, but moved to Kearney, New Jersey at age 13. He was one of the greatest stars of the first 50 years of U.S. soccer. After scoring 67 goals for Bethlehem Steel during the 1924-25 season, that was a record for goals in a season that stood until a guy named Lionel Messi broke it in 2012, people began referring to Archie as the Babe Ruth of American soccer. He played for the U.S. national team several times and scored 4 against Canada in 1925, so of course he was invited to play in the 1930 team, but he turned it down. See, no one at the time knew what the World Cup would mean, how big it would become. What Archie did know is that it would take him away for months, and he had just started a new automotive business with his brother-in-law in Kearney.
Archie's local rival, Davey the Little Giant Brown, didn't make the squad either. He was 5'3", 125 pounds, but scored lots of goals. He led the ASL with 56 in 1926-27, but hurt his knee in the weeks before the team left for Uruguay. The other babe was Adelino Billy Gonzalez, but I like his other nickname, Piano Legs. The son of immigrants from Madeira, Portugal, that same island that produced Cristiano Ronaldo, Billy was raised in Fall River. He's been called the most complete player in early American soccer. The 6'2", 210-pound forward had deft control and an eye for a long ball. Gonzalez was a winner too. He competed in 11 U.S. Open Cup finals and won 8.
Billy's teammate on that loaded Fall River team was Bert Patnaud, born in Massachusetts to French-Canadian parents. Just 20 years old as the calendar turned to 1930, he didn't inspire any nicknames, just Bert, but he was a lethal scorer and a proper soccer fanatic. There's a story that when he was a kid, he got hired to deliver groceries. One day there was a rush job, so his boss gave Bert a bicycle. Bert pedaled away, and he was about halfway to the customer when a bunch of boys waved him down and asked if he'd kick around with them. They were 1 short for 6-a-side. Bert said, sure, yeah, I'll play for a few minutes. Hours later, he got back on the bike, made the delivery, and went back to the store, where his boss was waiting for him. Sorry, young man, you no longer work here. But years later, Patnaud would say it had worked out for the best.
The ASL had this young core of players, guys like Billy, Davey, and Bert. They were ready to take on the world at that first World Cup. So the U.S. was the first country to send in its $200 registration fee.
The USFA staged trial matches where possibles and probables were invited to compete. The U.S. team ended up with 15 pros, 1 amateur, a coach, a trainer, and a manager for the trip to South America. The amateur was James Gentle, who'd gone to UPenn and played for the Philadelphia Cricket Club. While he was no doubt a good player, his language skills probably put him over the top to get on the squad. He was the only American on the team fluent in Spanish. But 3 of the country's best players stayed home. We've already talked about Archie Stark and Davy Brown. The third was Seamus O'Brien, who was initially picked, but then the USFA discovered that he wasn't yet a citizen. Those guys were all top attacking players, potential match winners.
That left room for Jim Brown, my friend's grandfather who came to the U.S. from Scotland in 1927. He played for the New York Giants and after scoring a couple goals in the trial matches, was selected. Technically, Brown also wasn't a citizen, but he declared his intent to become one and started the process that spring. 2 days into the voyage on the SS Munargo, which left from Hoboken, New Jersey on Friday the 13th, a telegram arrived that a Brooklyn courthouse had stamped Brown's papers. He was good to go.
Your friend James has shared some photographs of the boat ride from players' scrapbooks, and they're amazing. We'll put some in the episode video. The Scottish guys on the team looked like they were all about to play a round of golf at St. Andrews. And Tom Flory, the captain from Harrison, looked like he was having cocktails at the Explorers Club before opening King Tut's tomb. It's very Death on the Nile.
Not bad for an Italian kid from Jersey. Another of our great early homegrown players. Gaetano Thomas Flory was the son of Italian immigrants. His father was from just outside Rome and became the town junk dealer in Harrison, where Tab Ramos would be discovered 50 years later. The Florys were a family trying to find a foothold in the New World. And as with so many other families, two of the easiest paths were sports and the military. Tommy wasn't much for studies, having only an 8th grade education. So he grew up playing soccer and then joined the Navy. After serving, he turned pro and played for a handful of ASL teams. One tribute called him the Joe DiMaggio of soccer and said boys ripped their pants climbing a fence to watch him. When they'd get home, they'd tell their mothers, "I just had to get in to see Tommy Flory play. He's the greatest."
The U.S. team wasn't alone on the SS Menargo. The Mexican national team had come up earlier in the week and was sharing the ride down to Uruguay. The boat had to anchor briefly off Staten Island due to heavy fog, and they anchored again in Bermuda on the morning of June 16th, stayed for a few hours, and then continued on, crossing the equator on June 23rd.
Yeah, there's this scene as they cross the equator that you would definitely put in a movie, right?
There are a lot of maritime traditions about crossing the equator for the first time. And thanks to James Brown, we have photos of how the U.S. and Mexican teams celebrated their line crossing. Guys wore grass skirts and face paint, drank beers, and threw eggs at each other, while Tom Flory sat on a throne as King Neptune with a crown, beard, and trident.
But this was a work trip, not a pleasure cruise. The squad had a demanding trainer named Jack Cole, an Irishman from Glasgow who moved to New York in 1922, just before his 30th birthday. He'd made a name working with boxers, runners, and footballers, and when he came to the U.S., he was one of the most sought-after soccer trainers. He'd end up working with the New York Football Club, Skull and Steel in St. Louis, New York Giants, the Chicago Bricklayers, and the Brooklyn Wanderers.
Listening to those team names from 100 years ago, it is crazy that some people think the U.S. has no soccer history. And even crazier that some of those people are the voices of American soccer on Fox Sports. Anyway, Jack Cole was a key hire for the U.S. national team. A profile just before the tournament called him, quote, a great trainer, handler of men, and manhandler, unquote, which is actually kind of weird until you get to this paragraph. Quote, as a masseur and rubber down, he has no equal, for his big paws can do more effective work than a dozen pair of ordinary-sized hands, unquote. Not sure what those hands were doing when they crossed the equator, but I'm sure it was amazing.
James Brown bought Cole's scrapbook from a dealer. I picked it up for him at a posh London hotel. I was his bagman from Jersey. Well, there are pictures of training sessions on the Munargo, which didn't have enough deck room to run on, so it was calisthenics and pool workouts. I didn't see any massaging, but Cole would be an asset in Uruguay, where the U.S. team was among the fittest squads.
After 14 days at sea, the team disembarked at Rio de Janeiro, Brazil on June 27th. There, they met the U.S. ambassador and trained at Fluminense FC. They stayed for a couple days before taking a train to Santos, where they made their way to the beach to swim and play some baseball. The final leg of the journey saw them board another boat for Montevideo. It was pouring rain when they arrived on July 1st. It had been raining in Uruguay for a record 92 days straight. As the gangway clangs down onto the pier in Montevideo, and the U.S. and Mexican players take their first slippery steps onto Uruguay, let's pause for a quick break.
When we come back, training camp with the shot putters, a battle with the Belgians, and a war with Argentina, and the debut of the U.S. national team's only true denim kit. If you like what you're hearing, click to follow an American game so you won't miss any future stories about U.S. soccer.
We've got some good ones lined up. This is our history, and we think people should know it. So we want to share it with you. And if you like it, we hope you'll share it too. So, mash the like button, drop us a rating, tell your friends, etc.
I've got a PhD, so you don't have to.
That's right. Every episode will give you something to impress your friends at the bar or your next pickup game.
So subscribe, like, and share, and we'll keep the stories coming.
Okay, it's July 1st, 1930. The U.S. and Mexican national teams have finished the final leg of a long journey from Hoboken to Montevideo, and the World Cup is starting in about 2 weeks. Time to get off the boat and start training.
The streets were mobbed as cars brought the U.S. team to the Florida Hotel, and the U.S. crew immediately disliked it. Wilford Bill Cummings, the treasurer of the U.S. Football Association and general manager of the team, toured the city with Bob Millar to find more suitable accommodations. Truth be told, my wife has done the exact same thing.
Only for great reasons every time, I'm sure, though. They ended up choosing the Hotel des Anglais, the English hotel, on the city's outskirts.
A lot of the press corps was staying there, which helped the U.S. get some good media coverage during the tournament.
Yugoslavia and Chile would also stay at the Anglais when they arrived, but the Yugoslavs were still a full week away.
Yeah, most of the European teams were on a luxury liner called the Conte Verde. The boat was big enough to run on and had a weight room and a pool below deck. On June 21st, 1930, it set sail from Genoa with the Romanian team on board. The boat stopped off in southern France to pick up the French squad, 3 referees and a group of officials, including Jules Rimet, who had the trophy in a briefcase. In Barcelona, they were joined by the Belgians, and finally they picked up the Brazilian delegation in Rio, before arriving in Montevideo on the 4th of July. The U.S. team had a little parade that day, a welcome break from their rigorous training schedule.
Now, by the time the Yugoslavs committed to play, the Conte Verde was full, so they had to take a 3-day train ride to Marseille to catch the Florida, a pleasure cruiser, which is a kind of boat and not Jack Cole's nickname. The Egyptian team was supposed to join them, but their boat from Africa got slowed down by a storm, and the Florida left without them. There are conflicting accounts about whether the Egyptians really were delayed or pulled a whoops, we can't make it to get out of the trip. Either way, the Egyptians cabled their apologies, and the tournament continued with an awkward 13 teams.
Jack Cole had the U.S. training hard, and the Americans were already big guys compared to the European players, so the French called them the shot putters. Maurice Pinel, France's center half, later said,
The Americans always amused us when we saw them training, for they were always clad in tiny shorts which revealed enormous thighs like tree trunks, and they would go lapping and slogging round and round the track like long-distance runners.
Let's talk about those shorts. James Brown inherited his grandfather's shorts, and he just loaned them to the FIFA Museum, along with that Cole scrapbook and a third-place medal. More on that medal later. Jerseys survive, but shorts tend not to. So these blue shorts are rare, really rare. Take a guess who made them.
Not Nike or Adidas. Could it be the company Tom Cahill worked for? One of the first corporate backers of American soccer? The one, the only Spalding and Brothers?
Bingo. There's even a label inside. James contacted Spalding, and the company archivist is pretty sure that they were made in Brooklyn. Not much hipper than that. What do you think they were made of, Kirk?
Worsted wool?
Nope. Though nice job getting worsted into the episode, the streak continues. The shorts were denim.
Ah, the original denim kit.
Yes. I once met the late Peter Moore, who designed the famous 1994 kit for Adidas, but I bet he had no idea it was an homage to 1930.
Okay, training's over. We've got our kits. Time for the World Cup. On the eve of the tournament, a reporter asked manager Bill Cummings, "Do you think you can win?" And he said, quote, "If not, we wouldn't have come. That is our objective. If we don't achieve it, we will be left with the disappointment of having demonstrated our progress." Optimistic underdogs. You could pretty much cut and paste that onto every U.S. World Cup team since.
You sure can. The U.S. faced Belgium, on the first day of the tournament on July 13, 1930, at the Estadio Gran Parque Central. The field was wet and heavy after all that rain. Snow fell, the first in Montevideo in 5 years. For many of the U.S. players, these conditions reminded them of playing during the winters in the ASL. The team wore white uniforms with blue and red horizontal stripes on their socks.
The U.S. team entered carrying an Uruguayan flag out of respect to the hosts and singing the Stein song, which was the #1 hit in the U.S. in 1930. Let's give a little listen to set the mood.
Oh, fill the steins to dear old Maine, shout till the rafters ring.
Tom, what was the Stein song?
I had to look this up. It was the official song of the University of Maine, an army march that a student turned into a drinking song. Rudy Valley went to Maine in the 1920s, and when he went on to become a singer and a band leader, he recorded a faster version with a slightly different lyric. It's the only college song to ever become a #1 hit.
And that's a record that will probably never be matched. Now, in the opening minutes of that first game, the Belgians, wearing red uniforms, pressed the Americans with several scoring opportunities. Team general manager Bill Cummings.
Let me jump in. Who, small bit of trivia, was the mascot of the famous Pilgrims FC from episode 1. Incredible how all these early American soccer figures keep intersecting.
So Cummings kept an official account of the tournament, which has been a really valuable resource for historians. In his match report for Belgium, he wrote, quote, "The first 20 minutes were like hours of anguish, it taking that length of time for the boys' nervousness to wear off. Our halfbacks were mishitting and our forwards were way off, but fortunately our backs and goalie were unbeatable, successively staving off Belgium's too numerous chances to convert, they too being evidently under terrific strain in an endeavor to find their land legs." In the 23rd minute, according to FIFA's official match report, a, quote, lightning shot, unquote, from Jim Brown struck the Belgian crossbar and rebounded to U.S. left wing Bart McGee, whose first-time shot scored the first U.S. goal in World Cup history. Almost the first World Cup goal, period. France was playing Mexico at the same time, and Lucien Laurent had scored a few minutes earlier.
At one point, the Belgians, hearing so many players with Scottish burrs, lodged a complaint that it wasn't a legit American team.
Which helped create one of the big myths of that U.S. team, that it was a group of ringers who had all played pro soccer in Scotland and England.
And that's why some people dismiss their achievements in Uruguay. In his book, The Story of the World Cup, Brian Glanville wrote,
"The American team, managed by Jack Cole of Brooklyn Wanderers, was made up largely of British and Scottish pros.
The famous English sports writer got a lot wrong here. First, Cole was the trainer, not the manager.
And only one player, George Morehouse, had played in England before the World Cup. And that was 2 games as a trialist for the 2nd Division Leeds Reserves back in 1921-22, and then 2 more for Tranmere Rovers in the 3rd Division. Good player, not a hired gun.
Glanville's reputation gave the story legs like tree trunks, you could say. And while 6 of 16 were born outside the U.S., they were formed in the American soccer towns we love to celebrate, like Fall River, Kearney, Harrison, St. Louis, and Philadelphia.
Anyway, the Belgian complaint was quickly dismissed, as I think most Belgian complaints should be. And Fleury added a 2nd goal just before halftime.
And at the end of the game, Jimmy Brown made a great dribbling run and crossed the patent out for a 3rd goal. Cummings wrote it was one of the most brilliant plays in the entire tournament. Totally selfless lob over the goalkeeper's head. But years later, Jimmy Brown told his grandson, and I quote, "I don't know if it was selfless. I think I just mishit it."
The other highlight of the Belgium game is that Jimmy Douglas had the first shutout in a World Cup.
An Argentinian newspaper summed up the match like this: "Como una locomotora despacio el primer con 2 líneas y mayúscular." The U.S. was like a locomotive. Slow at first, fast at the finish.
4 days after Belgium, the U.S. faced Paraguay in front of a capacity crowd at the Estadio Gran Parque Central. After only 10 minutes, the U.S. went up 1-0 when Patnaud converted a cross from Andy Auld. Just 5 minutes later, Patnaud made it 2, when he beat the keeper to a ball from Ralph Tracy of St. Louis. The U.S. dominated in the second half, too, making it 3-0 when, after a solo run on the left, Auld passed it to Patnaud, who shot from a few yards out for the first hat trick in World Cup history.
The failed delivery boy really delivered.
And that's why they called him Bert. Anyway, the U.S. was able to coast to the final whistle with another shutout, saving their energy for the semifinal.
Not sure if that's been written about a U.S. team in a while. The U.S. had shocked the world with the best record of the tournament, coming out of the group stages. The team became a crowd favorite. They scored 6, allowing none. The team was viewed as a contender. One Argentinian commentator wrote,
"They're all talented athletes who play a smooth game and use their bodies well, although occasionally they commit fouls. They have a remarkable domination on high balls, which can be paralleled only by the great British and especially Scottish professional teams, whose way of playing perhaps they follow, but without monotonous precision and with much more vitality and enthusiasm. The fullbacks get rid of the ball with power and assurance. The midfield line defends, mixing very well with the fullbacks, and giving remarkable help to the forwards, who have a wonderful kick that they utilize for passes and for sending high balls into the goal area to exploit their superior heading capacities."
So what you're hearing there is this blend of the English and Scottish ways of playing, that the Americans were trying to take the best of both and apply it to their team.
Look, we don't want to overstate the tactical diversity of that first U.S. team, but it was a diverse team. We've mentioned English, Scots, Portuguese, French, Canadian, Italian. You've got a diverse group of people from a lot of different backgrounds who learn the game in different ways. And so even though Bill Cummings said at the time, we're basically playing the English game, it's impossible to not see the influence of the entire world on that American squad.
Yeah, and I mean, this is e pluribus unum, right? From many one. All these different styles, all these different people. We still need to figure that out, right? That's going to be the Shangri-La of a U.S. team at a World Cup when we finally figure that out. Anyway, Argentina. The U.S. is going to face Argentina in the first semifinal on July 26th in the newly completed Estadio Centenario.
Uruguay had been rushing to finish the stadium for the World Cup. It was the crown jewel of the tournament. Quote,
"You could fit the whole of the Roman Colosseum inside the Centenario."
unquote. That's what one journalist said. And the stadium could hold 93,000 people. It was a huge field, and the sod had only just been put down before the tournament started during those almost 100 straight days of rain. So the tournament officials had a bunch of flaming cauldrons suspended about a foot off the field all over it to try to dry it out and make it playable. It only sort of worked. By the time the U.S. and Argentina played the semifinal, chunks of sod had been ripped up. At kickoff, the U.S. was the home crowd favorite, though. Every Uruguayan wanted to see Argentina lose.
Of course, right? Montevideo and Buenos Aires are towns either side of the River Plate. Their rivalry was real. Both countries prized creative dribbling, short passing, even some showboating. But their play could also be physical, often violent. The Uruguayans called this fighting spirit Garra Charrua, a mix of determination and street smarts. Tab Ramos told me about that. He was born in Montevideo and came to New Jersey when he was 12. I don't know if Tab knows this, but the Uruguayan national team toured the U.S. in 1927. They got in 3 all-out brawls here. That's some Garra for you. Argentina was a much bigger country, more players, more clubs, so they didn't have to rely on the fighting spirit and pride so much. But they had it too. Their captain and midfield general, Luis Monti, epitomized it. He was an elegant player, but he could be a wrecking ball. His nickname was Doble Ancho, double wide. Back to the semifinal.
The U.S. had 2 things working against them. First was the size of the field, 100 yards wide by 138 yards long. We'll share a link to video from this World Cup. Even on grainy black and white film, the field is massive, and that was a challenge to the U.S. tactics. They like to sweep diagonal crosses to change the point of attack, but as Bill Cummings reported, quote,
"The game started with a bang, and while play appeared most even, it could be noticed that our long wing passes were falling short, and the usually long kicks of our backs that generally crossed the halfway mark were dropping in our own half of the field. the immense size of the playing pitch was treating us badly.
Unquote. And the second thing working against the U.S. was the tactical violence of Argentina.
And our friend Double Wide. That trailer park piece of trash terrorized the U.S. There's a cartoon of Monty as the Grim Reaper with body parts of U.S. players scattered around him.
4 minutes in, Jimmy Douglas was fouled, twisting his knee and leaving the U.S. keeper hobbling for the rest of the game. 15 minutes later, a horror foul on Ralph Tracy fractured his right leg, but he didn't realize it and played on it for the rest of the half, missing 2 chances because he couldn't kick properly. Argentina managed to score before the whistle to go into halftime up 1-0. After the break, Tracy was convinced to come back out. But since substitutions weren't allowed, the U.S. played down a man the entire second period.
And with Jimmy Douglas's injury, some said they were down a man and a half. Coach Bob Millar was furious with the Belgian referee. As a player, Millar once punched an opponent as they walked off at half. He was an elbows-up kind of guy. That Belgian ref, John Langinis, was a respected referee who went on to work the final, but in this game he was criticized for relying on his sideline assistants to make the calls for him. Tom Flory called the game murder. They crippled Douglas deliberately. They broke Tracy's leg. They hit Auld, he said.
The hit on Andy Auld was a notorious moment from the game. He got kicked in the mouth, getting his lip ripped open and, according to James Brown, losing 4 front teeth. Jack Cole went out to treat him, and according to legend, an Argentine player knocked the smelling salts out of Cole's hand, spilling into Andy Auld's eyes and blinding him for the next few minutes of the game.
Cole was part of another incident when he confronted Langinis in the second half, screaming at him about all the uncalled fouls. As he slammed his medical kit down in disgust, he broke a bottle of chloroform. I mean, who keeps chloroform in a medical kit?
Oh, those old school medical kits? They used to contain chloroform, cocaine, and a little bone saw.
Anyway, the fumes almost knocked Cole out, and he had to be helped off the field.
Which is a story that absolutely sounds like myth, but there are several reliable sources for it. So the Argentina game ended 6-1. And to be fair, Argentina was a world power. On a good field, with a better ref, they still would have been favorites.
Agreed. But let's hear from the influential Glanville one last time. His overall assessment of the tournament?
In the semi-final, alas, the much greater pace and sophistication of the Argentinians simply overwhelmed them and they crashed 6-1. In the second half, the Americans simply fell apart, conceding 5, the last 3 within 9 minutes.
Alas? What about the mauling we took? We fell apart because of the blatant, unchecked violence. I'm no friend of the referee, but come on.
I'm not disagreeing with you. Anyway, a year later, most of the same Argentina team was on a U.S. tour and played the U.S. again in Fall River. The U.S. won 6-1, which Gonzalez called Sweet Revenge. Back in Montevideo, the U.S. team stuck around to watch the final, where Uruguay beat Argentina. There were rumors before the game that Luis Monti had gotten death threats aimed at him and his family if he did to Uruguay what he had done to the United States. And Langinis, the referee, would not work the game until he knew there was an escape plan to get him back to his ship. But Uruguay won the first World Cup final 4-2, leaving Argentina the runners-up.
The U.S. wasn't officially named the third-place team until 1986, when FIFA awarded it on goals conceded. Jimmy Douglas's clean sheets and Jimmy Brown's late strike against Argentina were the difference.
There was no ceremony, though, no medals. The next challenge for the U.S. was to get home and to get paid on the way. They played a series of exhibition games in the weeks after the World Cup, getting a portion of the gate receipts for each one.
Yeah, they'd gotten expenses covered on the way down, but they'd been spending a lot and they were losing money from not working back at home, so they wanted to earn as much as they could. They lost their first 2 matches to Nacional and Peñarol. In Brazil, they played Santos, and after being down 3-1 at half, the U.S. battled back to win. Guys went under the bleachers to change because they weren't offered a changing room. Sounds like us growing up, youth soccer. And 10 minutes later, the referee walked over to say he'd made a mistake and was disallowing the winning goal. so the official score was 3-3.
But that was the vibe everywhere. The neutral refs were on their way back to Europe, and the local refs weren't going to give anything to the Americans. The team kept traveling and playing in Sao Paulo, Rio, and Botafogo. In the 6 exhibition games they played in Uruguay and Brazil, a total of 10 goals were disallowed for the U.S. There was actually a page on the official team report that logged actual goals scored and actual goals allowed. Back home, there was no parade waiting for them. Some family members were on the dock, along with a few soccer officials, like our old friends Tom Cahill and Dr. Gus Manning. But the guys just went back to their lives. Some even played league games that weekend.
And FIFA spent the next couple of years sending letters promising that the medals were on the way. Really, any day now. The players finally received them in 1932. They were more like charms, and Jimmy Brown's kids put his on a metal chain and wore it like a necklace. His son George was wearing it when he was in the sandbox one day. He didn't feel it slip off his neck, but when he got home, he realized it was gone. Big trouble. Days later, there was a knock on the door. Someone had found it, and young George breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it had J. Brown engraved on the back.
Unlike the 1994 World Cup, the U.S. success in Montevideo didn't inspire a domestic soccer boom. The Great Depression ravaged what was left of pro soccer. Bill Cummings wrote to Bob Millar in 1933, quote,
"Soccer speaking, things here in Chicago are awful, simply rotten. Only a handful of fans turn out. They're all out of work and no money. The players are in exactly the same boat, simply not getting enough to keep their stomachs filled to permit them playing the right kind of game. They all seem more or less worried about living rather than their game, and you can't blame them."
Unquote.
During the 1930s, rising anti-immigrant sentiment, one of American history's tragic rhymes, meant that American sports like gridiron football and baseball were favored over the immigrant sport of soccer, which retreated to where it began. Ethnic enclaves in cities like St. Louis, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and Philadelphia.
Despite the fact that, as we discussed in our last episode on the AFA Cup, many of the biggest stars of baseball and football, talking Babe Ruth, Joe DiMaggio, Bronco Nagurski, were immigrants or the children of immigrants. But in the United States, playing those sports assimilated you. Playing soccer made you an outsider.
As Kyle Rote Jr. wrote back in 1978 in his complete book of soccer, quote, "Soccer became a game for the un-American and the nonconformist, and such it was to remain until the 1970s, when the grandchildren of those who had shunned it would accept soccer as freely as baseball, football, and any other American institution." End quote. Some of the top American players went to play in the UK, but the game at home began what would be a 50-year dark age, what Kirk and I have identified as that middle chapter of U.S. soccer's roughly 150-year history.
The U.S. did send a team to the 1934 World Cup in Italy. 3 days before the tournament kicked off, the U.S. beat Mexico in a play-in game in Rome that was witnessed by 10,000 fans and Benito Mussolini, which is the kind of crowd that Gianni Infantino would be proud of. The score was not 2-0, but 4-2, with all the U.S. goals scored by Aldo Buff Dinelli, who was also a gridiron star. He went on to coach college and pro football, including the Pittsburgh Steelers.
But then Italy knocks out the U.S. 7-1 in the first round of the single elimination tournament. The Italians had drafted a handful of Argentines to switch countries and stack their home side's roster. Buff Dinelli scored the only goal, but it was marked by, guess who? Louis Monti.
I guess double wide was now called doppia larghezza. So, the 1930 World Cup was the last hurrah, or the last gasp, of that first 50 years of U.S. soccer.
But it was an impressive one that shouldn't be forgotten as we prepare for the next World Cup and the 100th anniversary of that team in 2030.
Because whatever the ups and downs of soccer in our country, or democracy and human rights in our country, soccer is, and has long been, an American game.
Let's celebrate it together.
This episode of An American Game is a production of Soccertown Media and was written by me, Kirk Riddell.
And me, Tom McCabe.
If you want to hear more of my thoughts on soccer, Hollywood, or whatever I happen to be annoyed by, you can find me on Blue Sky at rudell@bsky.com.
As for me, Kirk will have me in the archives digging up the next story, and on the Soccertown Media Instagram.
An American Game is a team effort. Our supervising producer and editor is Matthew Nelson.
Our videos are produced by Larry Garrity.
Our theme music was composed by our old friend and former teammate, Patrick White.
Special thanks to the Society for American Soccer History.
And thank you for listening. That makes you part of the team. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends.
We'll see you next week.